Okay, so this is Sufferance again, and this video is 10 minutes, thank God. This video is 10 minutes. So this is from Sufferance, and he's mentioning Kagurabachi made a monster. So Kagurabachi, I don't know if they got a new volume that just came out, new chapter that came out, or what the case may be, so we're going to see what that's about. So like, subscribe, share, follow, and comment, give Sufferance a follow, and all that great stuff. And let's see.
Ending of how Shinichi as a sword.
Will you just shut up for a minute and let me finish?
You believe this?
Operates action and attack wise, but also symbolically, what it represents, what it technically means. There's a lot of theory going into this, a lot of symbolism and interpretation, but it is clearer than the previous chapter, and I think that's very important. We know that Shinichi is heavily symbolized by the flowers, that's kind of what it spawns from, and that would be its general motif, but we have a bit more of a complex situation here. We're mixing motifs, we have different interpretations, and we have a clearer picture. So firstly, the flowers. Originally, we thought these were irises, and they technically still can be, but some of the more significant ones are actually white lilies. What a white lily represents is a lot of different things, but with this situation here and what I'm about to connect it to might sound like it makes more sense. So I think these white lilies actually represent rebirth, and I think that is what this whole sword actually is all about. And it's using insects as kind of its secondary motif with all of its attack: dragonfly, spider, centipede. The reason that these things go hand in hand really well is because insects are a great representation of rebirth, especially if your leading one is actually a butterfly going through transformation, a metamorphosis. To become a butterfly, you have to seal yourself away and wait for the right time until you can bloom into that next iteration. So you have white lilies that represent rebirth. You have a flower that leads you into those white lilies, which is transformation, also rebirth. But then there's something else that I don't think anyone has really mentioned, and that is the hilt or the tsuba of the sword. To me, at this moment, the design actually looks a little bit like a scarab, one of those large Egyptian dung beetles. It's difficult to 100% say that it looks like a scarab, but symbolically, I feel like it makes a lot of sense with the insect motif and especially the rebirth, because scarabs also represent a type of rebirth. When you join all of these things together, you have a sword that represents an evolution, a transformation, a rebirth. But one of the more interesting things that may or may not be a thing is actually the quote-unquote hijacking of Kiora. While he is wielding this sword, he feels like something is trying to hijack him, but he can't tell what it actually is. Is it the sword or is it the swordsman? Either or is very interesting, but currently my money is on the sword itself. There's a very big distinction between the two. The first would be that potentially, if the swordsman can actually do this while wielding Shinichi, they may be able to hijack different people, basically body swapping thanks to the operation of the sword and people trying to wield it. Or if it is the sword variation, it may be able to consume other wielders, hence bypassing the eternal contract that it has for the purpose of consumption, taking all of that knowledge and information of the person it's consumed back to the swordsman. Constantly goes through a metamorphosis and change every single time, being rebirth with new information. But I like the secondary, or I guess third motif for this, with the insects interlocking with hijacking. Parasites is a very big and common thing with insects, and you have a lot of parasitic nature with insects and that hijacking. So you go back to those options: swordsman hijacking another person, or a sword consuming the person that's trying to wield it that isn't actually part of the contract. Either way that you put it, it's very flexible, it's very powerful. Considering Kiora has not yet unsheathed this at all, we have not seen the blade technically, there's still a ton of power coming out of this. So much so that this whole chapter is a setup for Chihiro and Hiyuki to 2v1 him. Now we should keep in mind that Chihiro isn't fresh. He's been fighting quite a bit already, and he's going into this fight not heavily injured, but definitely weaker than what he would want to be. Hiyuki, on the other hand, is considerably fresh and has an ability that is on par with the swords. I think this is a really great showcase of what Shinichi, one of the more powerful swords, is actually capable of, and at this point may be one of the primary problems within the future. Shinichi seems to have a lot of flexibility, a lot of range, but also still a lot of mystery surrounding it. For example, Kiora was on his deathbed. He was extremely heavily injured, but thanks to the hijacking and whatever Kiora was trying to combat mentally, somehow he is still operating. Then the sword is keeping him alive. Now, when you run down that idea with rebirth and all of its symbolism, there's a potential conversation to have about pseudo-immortality, that the wielder of this quote-unquote eternal contract is actually immortal to some degree. As long as they're part of the sword will keep them alive as long as they potentially consume. It's like a win-win. The sword gets what it wants and the human gets to live. This would kind of explain why Kiora, even though he's not technically part of the contract, still wielding the power, and it's actually keeping him alive. I mention it like this because we've previously seen that the aggressive or evolution versions of these swords can be very detrimental. For Chihiro and Sojo, for example, when they push the sword to its limit, it becomes negatively affected towards them. They're draining all of their strength, and power quite easily could put them in a critical position. Even the Datenseki stone, which is like an artificial version of a piece of the sword, completely obliterated Kyora's son when he tried to use it. Now, to be fair, incredibly unstable and not really a great comparison, but at least a good representation. When you think about all of those conversations that line up to this moment, it's very interesting that Kiora is being kept on his feet, not by his own willpower or his own strength, but the sword itself. So far, this is what I have for the sword, and I think there's a lot of room for interpretation, a lot of room for growth, but more considerably, a lot of room for evolution. These swords are specific to their user, and while it's always going to have the flower insect motif with the idea of rebirth and destruction or transformation, how it is utilized and how it is transformed with the user itself is always incredibly different. This sword is going to be very, very problematic in the wrong hands, and we know that the Hishaku and the leader wants to wield this sword. So you can imagine the capabilities that it could have in a sorcerer of that caliber, and even someone that evil. Now, like I said before, Hiyuki is here to help, and I love this dynamic between both of their characters because they're very similar, yet they have this goofy, don't want to listen to each other type of attitude. So while they technically don't work,
the savings are here extra early with Black Friday in July.
and they're like water and oil. When things get moving, when things become understood, they work extremely well. And both of these characters are incredibly powerful on their own right, so coming together only makes sense. It's funny though, because Hiyuki's ability has actually been copied by Chihiro, at least one version of it, and I assume he can only fire this off once, being as it is a copy ability. I was curious on how Hiyuki would be kept under control, even though we had the prior encounter with her, but Hakuri made sure to let her know if she tries to do anything funny, he would kill her, basically let her rot within the subspace. The Kabanabi's reaction to this is kind of funny. They're not all too worried or taking the situation seriously, maybe because they feel comfortable with what's happening in the sense of getting their hands on Tanuchi, or at least being able to see it for the first time. And then you have obviously one of their own, Hiyuki, in their kind of close within vicinity, so it makes sense, I guess, why they're not really panicking. However, I do think the situation calls for them to be a little bit more attentive. Everyone is currently bidding on this sword. You don't know where it could actually go. They are there to bid on the sword too and win it to bring it back home. I thought they would be a little bit more alert because the seal that they've put on it has actually been broken. So if it does get sold to another person, the seal is irrelevant. It's just going to go to each individual. But I guess as a safety net for that seal being broken, the sword itself is just too powerful. So logically, for us as readers, another person probably won't be able to wield it, regardless of whose hands it gets into. But the question is, where does it go? And that is funny because the final panel you get to see is kind of like a three-way tug of war. You get all of this showcase of the sword, how crazy these abilities are, the bidding starting to happen, Hiyuki, Chihiro, and Kiora battling it out, all for this sword, right? Hiyuki is fighting for the Kabanabi, Kiora is fighting for his own merchandise, and Chihiro Chihiro is fighting for his family, so this tug of war has 2 losers. But it would be funny if there's 3. Remember, this whole thing right now is an experiment. What Kyoura is doing is falling right in the Hishaku's hands. They want to see what is possible, not having a full understanding, but at least knowing something, and that is incredibly valuable. So it does beg the question, who wins? I don't see Chihiro having the sword. I see Kyoura dying after this, and the Kabanabi, well, they're most likely going to get it, because they have the original swordsman or wielder, but I wouldn't be surprised, again, if the Hishaku threw a curveball in there, and it went somewhere else completely different. I do think this sword right here is going to be more of an endgame sword. We might not see it for a while, it might disappear for a while, hell, it might even just become a normal thing. It's difficult to tell with the Kagurabachi, but conceptually it feels very final, it feels very massive and big with the double seals and difficult to wield. It would at least make sense for me for it to be that way. As usual, beautiful artwork, beautiful fight. I am very excited to see Chihiro and Hiyuki work together, and honestly I don't think Kyoura has much longer left. I think we should expect some very entertaining chapters, and potentially some pretty big curveballs.
I wanted to make a thrill ride like you've never seen before.
Okay, so this is Sufferance. Like, subscribe, share, follow, and comment. I hope you guys enjoyed this. This is Kachabachi made a monster. Didn't do a lot of reacting to this because it was more like an explanation. I was just learning about it too. Since I'm not really reading the manga, it is what it is. So with that said, I'll see you guys in the next one. Laters.